I think all of us are ready for 2020 to be over. And yet there's no better time than right now as men and women of faith to carry the gospel, to carry this hope that we have into all the world, into our communities. There's no better time than now to be the kind of neighbor that the Lord is calling us to be. And that's what we're going to talk about for a few minutes today. Probably all of us are familiar with this thing called the Heimlich maneuver. In 1974, Dr. Henry Heimlich developed this way that would help people when they found themselves in a difficult spot when they were choking. Now, I'm especially grateful to Dr. Heimlich. Not long after Jana and I had moved here and we were married, not long after that, we were having lunch one Sunday afternoon with some people from church. And we were sitting at a table enjoying this wonderful Mexican feast. I was sitting right across the table from Jana, and I took a bite of a taco. And a piece of that taco shell somehow got lodged over my windpipe. And I found myself in a place where I suddenly couldn't breathe. And she looked across the table at me, and she could tell that I was struggling, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No," I nodded like I wasn't. And so she got up and moved behind me. Suddenly, everybody at the table and everybody in the room grew quiet. And only later did I see the humor as several of the guys got up and they stood behind Jana in case Jana didn't get the job done. They were going to have a whack at it as well. Jana got behind me. She did the Heimlich maneuver. She pulled about 3 or 4 times. Out popped the taco shell. And I was fine after that. But I got to tell you, it was one of the scariest moments of my life. Jana was incredibly motivated. I'll tell you later, she said to me, "Kevin, I wasn't going to let you die because I wasn't going to be alone by myself with those 3 boys." What you may not know is that Dr. Heimlich never had to use the Heimlich maneuver himself until later in life. In 2016, he was 96 years old, and he was sitting at a table having lunch at in this retirement community in Cincinnati, Ohio. And 87-year-old Patty Riss, who was sitting across from him, took a bite of a hamburger, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. And so Dr. Heimlich gets up, he goes behind her, he does his thing, out pops the obstruction, and she could live. Literally thousands of people's lives have been saved because of the Heimlich maneuver. But here's the fascinating thing. As I said, Dr. Heimlich, though he developed the Heimlich maneuver, though he wrote about the Heimlich maneuver, though he taught others to use it, he himself never used it until 2016 when he was in that retirement community in Cincinnati. We've been talking in this message series about the importance and the power of words. And words are important. Words are significant. But there comes a time when sometimes we need to go beyond words. There comes a time when sometimes words don't get it done. We need to do something. We need to be moved to action. And so we've been involved in this, the last 2 messages in our series I've titled Beyond Words. And we're going to continue that today as we think about how God calls us to be good neighbors. We're in Matthew chapter 22 like we were last Sunday morning. And last Sunday we saw that a religious leader comes to Jesus, an expert in the law, and he asks, "What's the greatest command?" And Jesus says, the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. And last week we paid attention to that little word, all. We're to love God in a certain way with everything that's in us, all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind. And today we're going to look at the second greatest commandment. And Jesus says, here's the second greatest commandment. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. What I really want to say today, and in a way this will kind of summarize the message, is this. The root of loving God produces the fruit of loving others. The root produces the fruit. Now, there's a tight connection between loving God and loving our neighbors. In fact, if we say we love God and don't love our neighbors, we really don't love God. If we love God, we'll love our neighbors, and as we love our neighbors, we in fact show our love for God. These two twin ideas are deeply rooted and connected to one another. Now, John puts it like this in that little book that comes near the end of your New Testament. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19, he says, "We love because He first loved us." And last Sunday morning we saw that because we have experienced this love from God, and that love is expressed most dramatically when Christ died on the cross for us, then our love is in response to God's love for us. But then in verse 20, John says, "Whoever claims to love God and yet hates his brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." Now, John, in a very direct and blunt way, says if you say you love God, but you hate your brother or sister, you are in fact a liar. And so, though I wouldn't use that language, John does. I'm a little reticent to say you're a liar, but John says if you don't love your brother or sister, that's in fact what you are. Now, last week we saw that Jesus tells us what it means to love God. He describes it. We're to love God with all that's in us. We love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, and all of our mind. And in a similar way, Jesus tells us how we are to love our neighbors. He doesn't just say, love your neighbors. No, He says, love your neighbor as yourself. We're to love our neighbor just like we love ourselves. We're to love our neighbors in the same way that we love ourselves. We're to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. Now, loving ourselves is instinctual. It's not something that we have to be commanded to do. It just comes from our humanity. It's deep within us. So when you're hungry, you know what you do? You go make sure you find some good food. And you do that because you're taking care of yourself. You're loving yourself. You're nurturing yourself. My wife, every morning when we're getting ready for our day, I'll notice she'll be putting on makeup and she'll be fixing her hair just so. She'll fret just a little bit over what she's going to wear. Why is she doing all this? It's because she loves herself and she loves me too, and that's a very good thing. It's just what we do. It's not a stretch to say we know ourselves more and think about ourselves more than any other person. And so we're to love our neighbors in the same way. Now, let me tell you what Jesus is not saying here. He's not saying, well, put yourself first. Now, this is a very worldly perspective. In fact, for many people, love yourself has replaced love your neighbor. Jesus is saying just like it's natural for us to think about caring for and tending to ourselves, in the same way we should care and have concern for and tend to our neighbors. Just like you care for you, you care for others. Now, to love someone is to pursue the good in others. So the idea of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves is really a pretty radical idea when you think about it. Now, here's the interesting irony. If you really want to have a healthy sense of self, here's what you do. You love God, you put Him first in your life, and then you focus on your neighbor, focus on others, loving and serving them, and amazingly, you start to feel better about yourself. But on the other hand, I have found the more I think about myself, the less I think of myself. You see, the world says you focus on you, and the Word says you focus on God and on your neighbor, and then amazingly you'll start to feel better about you and better about who God created you to be. And so let's get practical for a few minutes about what it means to love our neighbor. If we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, it means we're going to value our neighbor. We're going to appreciate our neighbor. We're going to want to know our neighbors at the very least. It also means we're going to forgive our neighbors. We're going to do things like we're going to pray for our neighbors. I know several people who occasionally will just walk around their neighborhoods and they'll spend time as they're walking just praying for their neighbors. They'll think about all that's going on in their neighbors' lives, at least the things they know about, and they'll just pray for them. They'll pray for their kids and pray for their health and just pray for them. And that's a wonderful thing. That's a good thing. But ultimately, it will mean if we love our neighbors, we will tangibly meet needs. And there's no better story to help us think about doing this than that very well-known story that our Lord teaches in Luke chapter 10. Now, this may be one of the one or two most familiar stories that Jesus tells. Probably the most familiar stories in Luke 15, where Jesus talks about the prodigal son. But Luke 10 is right up there. And so a religious insider comes to Jesus, and Jesus finds this insider, he knows the right words. He can say the right things. He knows what the two greatest commandments are. He knows the two greatest commandments are to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He utters those words. He can say that. But then this religious insider asks another question. He wants some clarification. He says, "Who is my neighbor?" If I can just figure out that question, I'll know who to love, and by implication, who I don't have to love. Who is my neighbor? I just want some clarity. And so in response to this religious man's question, Jesus tells a story. Now, one of the things you got to see in Scripture is that anytime somebody comes to Jesus with a question and Jesus tells a story, we know that person is in big trouble. And so Jesus tells this very familiar story, and the story goes like this. There was this man who was on his way from Jerusalem down to Jericho. That was a 17-mile journey. The road was twisting and winding. The road was very dangerous. It was not uncommon for there to be robbers or thieves to kind of lay in wait. And that's in fact what happened to this one person. He's making the journey. These robbers come upon him. He's beaten to within an inch of his life. Jesus tells us that he's left half dead. So I want you to picture him. There he is. He's lying beside the road. He's bleeding. It looks like he's half dead. He's naked. And that's where we see him. Now, for any story to hold your attention, there needs to be an element of surprise in the story. If you're watching a movie or if you're reading a book, if you can tell where the story is going, you're not really interested in that story. And Jesus' stories have an element of surprise in them. Now, we don't often see it because we've read the story so much and we're so familiar with them. But there are two big surprises in this story we find in Luke 10. And the first surprise has to do with the people who do not help him. The very people who should have helped him and could have helped him don't end up helping this man who is beaten. And so we learn about these two people we know as the priest and the Levite. And so the priest comes walking by, he sees the man, and what does he do? He makes a wide swath. He doesn't stop to help him. The Levite comes walking by. What does the Levite do? He does the same thing. He makes a wide swath, and he doesn't stop to help. Two people who could have helped and should have helped. Religious insiders do not stop to help. They don't do anything. Now, there have been moments we could look at in our own Christian history where men and women of faith could have done something, should have done something, and instead they walk around on the other side. Now, this is an important cultural moment that we find ourselves in. When George Floyd was killed, it brought to light issues that needed to be addressed. And we know as the church, we're called to be the conscience of the community. And so when there are things going on, we as God's people need to be the first to help and the first to speak out. One of my favorite preachers, you've heard me quote him before, is Dr. Tony Evans. And Dr. Evans writes, racism isn't a bad thing, it isn't a mistake, it's sin. And the answer is not sociology, but theology. And so, a few weeks ago, I was glad when our elders read a statement about our desire to make a difference. You see, we don't want to be like the religious insiders who simply walk around the hurting. We desire for College Hills to be a place that is open and loving for all people. And the document that was read acknowledged there's still racism in our country. There's still work to do. And we as God's people, we want to be part of the solution. We wish, as we said, to be instruments of reconciliation, instruments of peace. And so I loved after Tom Wallace, one of our elders, after he read the statement, I loved how the church responded. You burst into applause. And that says something to me good about your heart. Good about how you want to be people who don't walk around, but who do something. And so if the first surprise in this story in Luke 10 is who didn't help, well then the second surprise in the story is who did help. Here comes a Samaritan. Now you've got to know that Jews and Samaritans have a long history, a history of racial and religious hatred. And so here comes the Samaritan, and he is the one who helps. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a sermon he once preached on this particular passage, wrote these words, or spoke these words. He said, the first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan reversed the question. If I do not help this man, what will happen to him? And that's the far better question, isn't it? And so as the Samaritan had compassion, it welled up in his heart and it moved him to action. And I want you to notice what his action looks like. Just look at all the verbs. And we'll see that in just a moment in verse 35. But first in verse 33, notice it says that the Samaritan came to where the man was. Now you contrast the Samaritan to the religious insiders. The religious insiders, they saw the man clearly, but they walked around. They went on the other side. But the Samaritan, no, he came to where the man was. You see, when we look into the eyes of the hurting, when we come near those who are struggling, then we begin to understand and we begin to empathize, and that empathy wells up in our hearts and it'll move us to action. We'll come to the place where we'll say, we have to do something. We can't just stand on the sidelines. And so notice what he did in verse 35. Look again at the verbs. It says the Samaritan went to him. He bandaged his wounds. He put on oil and wine. He puts him on his donkey. He brings him to the inn. He takes care of him. And then he comes back the next day. He pays the innkeeper a couple of denarii. 1 denarii was equivalent to 1 day's work. And the next day when he comes back, he says, if there's something else I need to do to help, if there's some more money I need to give, I'll give that as well. This man is a perfect example of someone who loved his neighbor as he would love himself. So friends, as we think about loving our neighbors, it involves time and it involves effort, and loving our neighbors will cost us some money, and loving our neighbors is often inconvenient. It'll mess with our schedules. And so as we think about loving our neighbors, let's go back to the man's question at the very beginning of this story. He asked the question, who is my neighbor? How would you answer that question? I think after reading this chapter, this story, we would have to see that a neighbor is anyone whose need you see and whose need you are in a position to meet. I know most often when I read this story, I relate most closely to the priest and the Levite. I look at these religious insiders. That's in fact what I am. And I think to myself, I can kind of relate to them. I'm busy and hurried, and oftentimes we as people become risk averse. And so when we see these risky, messy opportunities to do good, more often than not, we move on to the other side. Don't get me wrong. We don't wish to harm anyone. We're just not so sure we want to get involved. But the more I think about this story, the more I ponder this message of Jesus, the more I think to myself, I can most closely relate to the guy in the ditch. Because I've been there. I've been the person in the ditch. I'm laying there helpless and wounded. I'm wounded by my own choices. I'm wounded by my sin. I'm wounded by my past. I'm wounded by what others have said and others have done to me. And there I am, half dead, wounded by the influence of sin and Satan. And I'm the one who desperately needs to be rescued, and so are you. And then amazingly, along comes the real Good Samaritan. And the real Good Samaritan is Jesus. Jesus, like the Good Samaritan in our story, is despised and rejected. When Jesus was born into this world, there were rumors and people were talking. He was despised and rejected. And He comes to us to save us at cost to Himself. And Jesus didn't just pay a couple of denarii. Oh no, Jesus paid with His own life. And Jesus didn't just pour on our wounds oil and wine. Oh no, Jesus poured out His blood on a cross for our sins. And what does Jesus do? He speaks tenderly to us. He lifts us up in His arms. And Jesus takes us to that place of healing. When I've experienced this kind of love, when I've been treated in this way by Jesus, when I see and experience the love of God, my heart will respond with love to Him, love for Him. And it's then that I'm given the resources to become the kind of neighbor that God's calling me to be. It's then that I'm transformed into a different kind of person. And I love people with the love of God. I begin to love my neighbor as I love my own self. My prayer for us is that Christ will live in us. Christ will work through us. He'll work through us for the sake of our neighbors, for the sake of our community, and ultimately for the sake of the world. And so this week, I want to challenge you to look for opportunities to truly be a neighbor to others, to look for opportunities to love people as you've been loved. God bless you. If we can continue this conversation, I'd love to continue it. Reach out to me. My email is kowen@collegehills.org. Call me at the church office. Love to help you in any way I can. I hope you have a great week this coming week.